The city was alive with movement, people rushing to work, cars honking, neon signs flickering in the cold evening air. But in the shadows of a bustling cafe, one man sat motionless, invisible to the world around him. John Mitchell. Once he was a leader, a soldier, a protector. Now he was just another homeless man, forgotten by the very society he had once fought to defend. His hands, rough and calloused, trembled as he clutched a small cup of coffee, a rare kindness from a passing stranger. But what no one knew was that John Mitchell was no ordinary man, and soon the world would remember his name. Years ago, Sergeant John Mitchell stood tall, his uniform crisp, his medals gleaming, a symbol of discipline and sacrifice. He had served with pride, leading men into battle, risking his life for his country. But when the war ended, another battle began. Returning home, John found himself lost in a world that no longer felt familiar. His friends had moved on. His family had grown distant. The job he was promised disappeared, leaving him stranded in a civilian life he no longer understood. At first, he tried. He filled out applications, attended interviews, and followed every rule. But rejection after rejection wore him down. Employers saw his military past as a burden, not an asset. The skills that had once made him a hero were now deemed useless. Then the inevitable happened. His savings ran out. The rent was overdue. And one cold night, his landlord's patience ended. John Mitchell was homeless. The streets were unforgiving. Every day was a battle against hunger, against the cold, against the loneliness that threatened to consume him. John learned to survive with little. Shelters provided meals when they could, and kindness came in rare, fleeting moments. The cafe manager, noticing him sitting nearby, would occasionally offer leftovers. These small gestures of humanity kept him going, but not everyone was kind. One evening, as John sat in his usual spot, a decision was made that would change his life. The cafe manager, worried about the image of the establishment, made a call. Minutes later, a police officer arrived. "Sir, you can't stay here," the officer said firmly. John didn't argue. Years of discipline had taught him to follow orders. Quietly, he gathered his few belongings and stood. But then, "I'm sorry, sir, but we've had complaints." The officer's voice softened, but his grip tightened. John's heart sank. He had hoped just this once to be left in peace. Instead, he was led away, booked for trespassing. Sitting in the cold steel of the holding cell, he stared at the floor. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, but nothing had prepared him for this. The feeling of being utterly forgotten. The day of his hearing, John walked into the courtroom, head low. He didn't expect sympathy. He never did. His clothes, a mismatched donation from the shelter, hung loosely on his frail frame. His hands trembled as he clasped them together, waiting for his name to be called. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. She flipped through the files, pausing when she reached his. Her sharp eyes scanned the paper before settling on him. "John Mitchell." John nodded, his throat dry. The judge read further, then stopped. She looked up, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. "Mr. Mitchell," she hesitated. "Were you in the 80th Airborne Division?" The room held its breath. John's eyes widened. A flood of memories rushed back. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "I served a long time ago." The judge leaned back, her eyes misty. "My brother served in that same division," she said, her voice softer now. "He often spoke of a man who saved his life, a soldier he called a hero. That man's name was John Mitchell." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. No longer was he just another homeless man, he was a hero. The judge cleared her throat, visibly moved. "This man," she said firmly, "served our country with more courage than many of us can comprehend. And yet, today, he stands here accused of trying to find shelter. This is not justice." She turned to John, her voice gentle. "Mr. Mitchell, I am dismissing these charges. Furthermore, I am ordering immediate assistance for you. You deserve more than this." You deserve respect, support, and a place to call home." Tears welled up in John's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a failure, but as someone who mattered. After the hearing, the judge personally arranged for John to be connected with a veterans outreach program. Within days, he had temporary housing, counseling, and, most importantly, a reason to hope again. At the shelter, John met others like him, veterans who had faced the same struggles. Together, they formed a small community, supporting one another through their shared pain. Slowly, he began to rebuild. He started volunteering, mentoring younger veterans who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, he passed the cafe where it had all started. The manager, the one who had called the police, stood at the counter, eyes filled with regret. John simply smiled and nodded. No bitterness, no anger. He had found peace. Months later, John was invited to speak at a community event honoring veterans. Standing before a crowd, he shared his story, not just of war, but of the battles he had fought afterward. He spoke of the loneliness, the rejection, the small acts of kindness that had saved him. His words moved the audience. By the end of the event, local organizations pledged to do more for veterans like him. People approached him, offering support, thanking him for his service, not just on the battlefield, but for his resilience. By the end of the year, John had secured a small apartment. On his wall hung a framed photo of his unit, a reminder of the brotherhood that had shaped him. Next to it, a letter from the judge, thanking him for his service. John Mitchell's journey wasn't over. But for the first time in years, he faced the future with hope. He was no longer invisible, and as he sat by his window, sipping a warm cup of coffee, he allowed himself to dream again. Because heroes are never truly forgotten. If you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, share this story. Let's make sure no veteran is left behind.